In Standard 1130, there are common impairments, which include 6. A personal conflict of interest, a scope limitation including a restriction of access to records, personnel, or properties, resource limitation, which includes funding limitation, situations where the auditor is assessing operation for which they were previously responsible, assurance engagement for functions over which the CAE has previously had responsibility, consulting engagement in areas where assurance engagements are also performed. Conflict of interest. Conflict are common cause of impairment of objectivity for internal auditor. Standard 1120, conflict of interest is a situation in which internal auditor, who is in a position of trust, has a competing professional or personal interest. Such competing interests can make it difficult to fulfill his or her duty impartially. A conflict of interest exists even if no unethical or improper act result. A conflict of interest can create an appearance of impropriety that can undermine confidence in internal auditor. The internal audit activity and the profession, a conflict of interest could impair an individual's ability to perform his or her duties and responsibilities objectively. A scope limitation is a restriction placed in internal audit activity that precludes the activity from accomplishing its objectives and plans. Among other things, a scope limitation may restrict the scope defined in internal audit charter, internal audit activity access to records, personnel, and physical property relevant to the performance of engagement, approve engagement work schedule, performance of necessary engagement procedures, and approve staffing plan and financial budget. A scope limitation, along with its potential effect, needs to be communicated, preferably in writing to the board. The CAE needs to consider whether it's appropriate to inform the board regarding scope limitation that were previously communicated to and accepted by the board. This may be necessary particularly when there have been organization, boards, senior management, or other changes. Addressing conflict of interest. An auditor with a conflict of interest in assurance engagement should be removed. Any conflict of interest in a consulting engagement should be disclosed to the client. Recommendations on objectivity. The internal auditor objectivity is not considered impaired when the auditor recommends standards of control or reviewing procedures before they are implemented. However, objectivity is considered to be impaired if the auditor design, install, draft procedure for or operate such systems. Auditing past and future work areas. If an individual is assigned to assessment engagement where he or she worked in the past year, objectivity is presumed be impaired and such facts should be clearly stated when communicating the result relating to the area that was audited. Practice Advisory 1130, assessing operation for which internal auditors were previously responsible. A primary related standard 1130, internal auditor must refrain from assessing specific operation for which they were previously responsible. Objectivity is presumed to be impaired if an auditor provides assurance services for an activity for which the auditor had responsibility within the previous year. A persons transferred to or temporarily engaged by the internal audit activity should not be assigned to audit those activities they previously performed, or for which they had management responsibility until at least 1 year has elapsed. Such assignments are presumed to be impaired objectivity, and additional consideration should be exercised when supervising the engagement work and communicating engagement results. Resource limitation. Without sufficient resources and funding, the IAA may not be able to operate independently and objectively, assessing previous areas of responsibility. Objectivity is assumed to be impaired if an auditor performs an assurance review of any activity over which he or she had responsibility within the past 1 year. Objectivity is also impaired when auditors are auditing an area for which they will have future responsibility within 1 year after the engagement. previous responsibility in non-audit functions. It is possible that management could ask an internal auditor to assume responsibility for a part of operation that could be subject to periodic internal auditing assessment. Internal auditors should not accept such assignments, but it is possible that management may insist. Non-audit function engagement. The CAE could minimize the impairment to objectivity by using a third party to complete the audit of that area. Internal audit responsibility for other functions. Non-audit. Internal auditors are not to accept responsibility for non-audit functions or duties that are subject to periodic internal audit assessment. If they have this responsibility, then they are not functioning as internal auditors. Second is when the internal audit activity, chief audit executive, or individual internal auditor is responsible for or management is considering assigning an operational responsibility that the internal and objectivity may be impaired. At a minimum, the CAE needs to consider the following factors in assessing the impact on the independence and objectivity. Requirements of code and ethics standard, expectation of stakeholders that may include the stakeholders board of directors, management, legislative bodies, public entities, regulatory bodies, and public interest group. Allowance or restriction contained in internal audit charter, disclosure required by the standard, audit coverage of activities or responsibilities undertaken by the internal auditor, significance of the operational function to the organization in terms of revenue, expenses, reputation, and influence, length or duration of assignment, and scope of responsibility, and adequacy of separation of duties. Also, whether there is any history or other evidence that the internal auditor objectivity may be at risk. If the internal audit charter contains a specific restriction or limiting language regarding the assignment of non-audit function to the internal auditor, then disclosure and discussion with management of such restriction is necessary. If management insists on such assignment, then disclosure and discussion of this matter with the board is necessary. If the internal audit charter is silent on this matter, the guidance noted in the points below are to be considered. All the points noted below are subordinated to the language of the internal audit charter. Consulting services. Internal auditors may provide consulting services to areas over which they had previous responsibility, but the auditors must still act in an independent and objective manner. Any potential impairment to their independence or objectivity must be disclosed to the engagement client before the engagement is accepted.